My name is Vivian. I'm 33 years old. Last week, my mother told a table of 20 relatives that I was wasting my life drawing houses. She said my brother had the real career. She doesn't know that 5 years later I'd be on that stage, or that the man 2 seats away recorded every word. My father nodded along. My grandmother, who paid for my architecture degree, stayed silent and did not correct her. The wine glass in her hand trembled once, a thin red line sloshing against the rim, then steadied. I watched the liquid settle. It looked like blood under the chandelier light. I opened my phone and sent a text to the AI president. Please bring your phone tonight. I want you to hear something before the ceremony. His reply came back fast. A voice memo labeled Dinner Au 12. M4A. The subject line reads, "It's all here. See you at the stage." The screen of my phone glowed with that message, the blue light casting a thin line across my wrist. I knew in 2 days, the truth would either set me free or bury me deeper. I slid the phone into my jacket pocket, my fingers brushing against a flash drive I had kept there for 3 months, 3 months of waiting, watching, and not saying a word. The metal was warm from my skin, warmed by hours of my palm pressing against it in meetings, in hallways, in the dark of my studio. I pressed my thumb into it. Hard. The edge left a faint red line on my skin. From the hallway I heard my grandmother's footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. The familiar creak of the 3rd floorboard from the left. She paused outside my door. I waited for her to knock. She never did. The floorboard creaked once, then silence. I pressed my palm flat against the door, feeling the wood grain under my fingers, and counted the seconds until her footsteps faded down the stairs. 23. 24. Gone. To understand why this happened, I need to tell you about my family. I grew up in Chicago, the daughter my mother always compared unfavorably to my older brother, even though architecture was my obsession from age 12. I remember the night before my first architecture exam. I was so nervous I could not sleep. My mother came into my room, sat on the edge of my bed, and whispered, "You see things others don't, Vivian. That's a gift." She left a cup of tea on my nightstand. The steam curled upward in the dim light, a thin spiral that disappeared into the shadows near the ceiling. That was the last time I believed she saw me. Years later, I learned she had her own architecture license quietly revoked after a forgery scandal. My success reminds her of what she lost. I found the evidence in my grandmother's attic, a yellowed memo from the state licensing board with my mother's name typed at the bottom and the word confidential stamped across it in red ink. I held it in my hands and felt the paper crack like dry leaves. The ink had faded in spots, but her signature was still there, the same looped M she used on my birthday cards. A thin layer of dust coated my fingers when I set it down, gray and fine as ash. I wiped it on my jeans. The dust clung to the denim like gilt. What I did not know then was that my grandmother had been keeping that folder for 5 years, waiting for the moment I'd need it. I slipped the memo back into the folder and closed the attic door. The hinges groaned. Dust motes floated in the slanted afternoon light, catching on my eyelashes. In my pocket, my phone buzzed again. I pulled it out and saw the same message from the EIA president, "See you at the stage." I stared at it until the screen went dark. The words burned into my memory. From the hallway below, I heard my grandmother's footsteps, slow, deliberate, as if she knew exactly what I had just uncovered. She said nothing. She never did. Not then. But I also remember the neighbor, Peter, who lived 2 doors down. He was a retired contractor with calloused hands and a quiet way of nodding that made you feel heard. When I was 16, he let me measure his garage just to practice. My mother called it a waste of his time. Peter never defended me, but he never stopped letting me borrow his tools. I kept that in my chest like a small, warm thing. The day he handed me his old measuring tape, he said, "You'll build something real one day." Then he went back to his workshop and didn't mention it again. I still have that tape. The metal hook is bent from years of use, but it still works. Sometimes I run my thumb over the bend and remember the weight of his words. And there was my cousin Margot. She was 4 years older. At family gatherings, she always sat at the far end of the table, quiet, watching. I never knew what she was thinking until years later. I remember once she looked at me across a Thanksgiving table and held my gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she looked away. I thought nothing of it at the time. But she was storing something. I realize now. She was waiting. I thought back to the first time I felt her pull the ground out from under me. I had drawn a sketch of our house from memory, every window, every brick. I left it on the kitchen table, face up, hoping she'd see it. My mother picked it up, studied it, and said nothing. She set it down, face down. Later, I found it in the trash, torn in half. I smoothed the pieces out with my palm and hid them under my bed. That night I pressed my back against the cold floor and listened to the radiator hiss, telling myself she must have thought it was garbage. The hissing stopped and started, like a heartbeat I couldn't control. My grandmother found me there an hour later. She did not ask. She simply laid a blanket over me and left a glass of water on the floor. I heard her footsteps pause at the door, then continue down the hall. The next morning, my brother found the torn pieces under my bed. He held them up and said, "Mom was right. It's not even straight." I grabbed them back so fast, the paper cut my thumb. My fingers trembled so much I tore one corner. I hid the pieces in a shoebox and taped the lid shut with 3 strips of packing tape, sealing it like a crime scene. The tape pulled at my skin when I pressed it flat. I smelled the glue, sharp and chemical, and for a moment I thought I might throw up. I told her I wanted to enter a youth architecture competition. She laughed and said, "You can barely pass math." I sat at the dining table for 2 hours with the application form in front of me. The overhead light buzzed. I filled it out with a pencil, erased it, filled it out again, erased it again. I ended up not sending it. I folded it into a tight square and slid it into the back of my desk drawer, where it stayed for years. My brother walked past the table, saw me erasing, and smirked. He didn't say anything either. He never needed to. That evening, my grandmother came into my room. She sat on the edge of my bed, the same spot my mother had used years before. She placed a wooden drafting ruler on my pillow. The wood was smooth, the edges softened from decades of use. "I used this when I was a girl," she said. "Keep it. You'll need it." I held it all night, the wood warm against my palm, my thumb tracing the faint pencil marks still visible on the surface. I smelled pencil shavings and something older, like the inside of a church. I pressed the ruler against my cheek and closed my eyes. For one night, I believed her. The atrium was packed, sunlight cutting through the glass roof, the smell of roses so thick it made my head spin. My portfolio was heavy under my arm, the degree rolled tight in my hand, the ribbon pressing into my skin. My mother pulled me aside and whispered, "You'll never build anything real. A degree doesn't give you talent." Her breath smelled like champagne. My brother nodded behind her. I said nothing. I held my degree so tightly the paper left red marks on my palm. I walked to my car and sat in the silence for an hour. I did not drive anywhere. I just sat there until the parking lot emptied, watching my own hands shake. The rose petals on my dashboard wilted by the time I finally started the engine, their edges curling brown. When I got home, I opened the shoebox with the torn sketch. The pieces had yellowed. I laid them out on my desk, one by one, and traced the lines with my finger. My grandmother's ruler was beside me. I did not glue the pieces back. I left them scattered. I wanted to remember what she had done. I wanted to remember that she had torn it in half with her own hands. A small library renovation. I was so proud I drove to my mother's house with the renderings. I spread them on her kitchen table under the buzzing overhead light. The placemat had old coffee stains. She pushed the drawings back, knocked over a cup, and said, "This is embarrassing. You have no sense of space. Your brother's business degree will actually pay for something." I picked up the wet drawings, laid them flat to dry on the counter, and quietly left. That night, I bought a locked file box from an office supply store. I started saving every email, every sketch, every timestamp. I dated each one and stored them like they were evidence of a crime I had not committed yet. I also bought a second flash drive. I labeled it Proof in Sharpie and hid it inside the hollow of my grandmother's old ruler. The wood still smelled faintly of pencil shavings. The drive clicked into place with a sound so small I almost missed it. I ran my finger along the ruler's edge. Smooth. Unbroken. A small community center in Evanston. I drove my mother to see it. She stood on the sidewalk for 5 minutes, staring at the brick facade. She did not say a word. She got back in the car and said, "It's fine, nothing special." I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white. I did not speak for the entire drive home. The next day, my brother called to tell me she had shown the project photos to her book club and said, "Anyone could have done this." I hung up and sat on my studio floor for 20 minutes, counting the cracks in the ceiling. Then I opened my file box and added a new folder. Project 1, completion date, witnesses, mother's response. I wrote everything down, every word, and dated it. My hand did not shake. I wrote her exact words. Anyone could have done this. Underneath I wrote the date, the location, the names of the 5 women who had been in the room. I closed the box and locked it. I was alone in my studio at midnight, drafting a new project, when my phone rang. It was Peter. His voice was thin. "I heard what your mother said at the book club. I wanted you to know. I told them she was wrong. I told them you built that place with your own hands." I leaned my forehead against the drafting table. The lamp hummed. The wood was cool against my skin. "Thank you," I said. He paused. I should have said it years ago. I stayed on the line for another minute, listening to him breathe. Then he hung up. I set the phone down and stared at the sketch in front of me. My hand was steady. I kept drawing. I drew the line for the foundation, straight, true. I thought of Peter's hands, the calluses, the measuring tape he had given me. I drew the next line. It was my aunt's birthday. My mother announced to the table that I was still waiting for a real job. My cousin Marga, who I barely knew, looked up from her plate. Her fork stopped mid-air. She looked at me, then at my mother, then back at me. She did not say anything, but she did not smile either. That night, Margot found me in the kitchen. She said, "I know what she's doing. I've seen it before." I nodded, not trusting my voice. She squeezed my arm once, hard, and walked out. I stood there for a long time, my hand pressed against the cold counter, the weight of her words settling somewhere deep. The refrigerator hummed. The window above the sink showed my reflection, my face, my mother's jawline. I turned away. I thought about Margot's grip on my arm. It had not been gentle. It had been the grip of someone who knew something I didn't. A high-profile urban renewal contract. I was the youngest architect shortlisted. My mother heard about it through a family friend. She called me at 11 p.m. and said, "Don't embarrass us. You'll lose it like you lose everything." I held the phone away from my ear and stared at the ceiling. Her voice was tinny, distant. I did not respond. I hung up and opened my file box. I took out every document, every email, every sketch. I laid them on my studio floor in chronological order, covering the entire surface. I stood in the middle and looked at the map of my life, every rejection, every dismissal, every quiet act of survival. I took a photo of it with my phone. I still have it. The carpet fibers pressed into my knees as I crawled across the floor, arranging the pieces like a city grid. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't need to. At 3 a.m., I stood up and walked to the window. The city was dark, except for a few lights in the skyscrapers. I thought of the building I had designed for the contract. I thought of my grandmother's ruler. I thought of the torn sketch under my bed, and I knew what I had to do. 2 days before the award ceremony, my mother cornered me in the hallway at my grandmother's house. She grabbed my wrist and whispered, "You'll never be an architect. Give up." Her nails dug into my skin. I pulled away and she laughed. A thin red line appeared on my wrist. I rubbed it with my thumb. The skin was raw, warm. Then I heard her telling my aunt the same thing 5 minutes later, laughing about that silly award she thought she was getting. The family dinner was the same night. 20 relatives, the long table, the wine glasses, the smell of roasted meat. My grandmother had invited a guest I did not expect, the president of the American Institute of Architects. My mother did not know who he was. She held forth at the table like she owned the room. I looked at my mother's smug face and remembered the tea she brought me before my first exam. I remembered her words, "You see things others don't." I wanted to believe that girl still existed somewhere, but then she looked at me and said, loud enough for everyone, "Vivienne, still drawing houses. My son has a real career." My father nodded. My grandmother's hands trembled around her wineglass, but she said nothing. A thin line of red wine sloshed against the rim. My cousin Margot set her fork down with a soft clink and stared at the tablecloth. A neighbor, Peter, who had been invited by my grandmother, looked up from his plate, his brow furrowed. No one spoke. My aunt reached for the breadbasket, her fingers hesitating for a moment before she pulled it toward herself without looking at me. Across the table, my uncle, my mother's brother, set his knife down with a small clatter. He did not look at my mother. He looked at his plate. I saw the a president quietly press record on his phone. He caught my eye and gave me the smallest nod. The red light on his phone was steady, a tiny dot of certainty in the dim room. Then, something unexpected happened. Margot, my cousin, stood up. Her chair scraped against the hardwood floor so hard the sound echoed. She said, "Aunt, that's not fair." Her voice was low but clear. The table went silent. My mother stared at her, incredulous. Margot's face flushed, and after a second she sat back down, but the damage was done. A ripple passed through the room. My aunt on the other side of the table whispered something to her husband, and he shook his head. My uncle, who had been carving the roast, set the knife down with a clatter. My brother stared at his plate. His jaw was tight. I saw him grip his fork. His knuckles were white. My mother recovered quickly. She forced a laugh and said, "Margot, you've always been too sensitive." She turned back to me, her smile sharp. "See? Even your own family knows you're not cut out for it." I looked at my mother's smug face and felt the phone in my pocket buzz once. I did not check it. I knew what it said. The award ceremony is in 2 days. After that, she'll be standing on a stage, and I'll finally know whether anyone will ever hear the truth. When everyone left, I stayed behind and walked to the empty dining room. The overhead light buzzed. I picked up my grandmother's wineglass and stared at the faint lipstick stain on the rim. I set it down carefully and walked out, my phone still warm in my pocket, the unread message waiting. In the driveway, Peter the neighbor was getting into his car. He paused, looked at me, and said, "Your cousin stood up for you." That took guts. I nodded, not trusting my voice. He got in and drove away, leaving me alone under the street lamp. The light flickered once, then held steady. I watched his taillights disappear down the block. Before I left, my grandmother called me back inside. She stood in the kitchen, hands on the counter. She did not look at me. She said, "I've been waiting for the right time. It's almost here." I waited for more. She said nothing. I kissed her cheek and walked out. Her skin smelled like lavender. The weight of her words stayed with me the whole drive home. I drove with one hand on the steering wheel and one hand pressed against my chest, feeling my heartbeat. Steady. After the dinner, I drove to the empty convention center. I sat in the parking lot with the EAI invitation on my passenger seat and watched the rain streak down the windshield. I did not move for 45 minutes. The wipers stayed off. The glass blurred until I could barely see the building. A drop of water slid down the outside, and I followed it with my eyes until it disappeared under the wiper blade. Another drop followed. Then another. I watched them race. I called my grandmother's voicemail. She did not answer. I left a message, and my voice cracked on the words. "You were there. You heard her." Why didn't you say anything? I listened to the beep, and then the silence. The silence stretched so long, I thought the line had gone dead. I pressed my forehead against the steering wheel. The plastic was cool. My breath fogged the dashboard. A single drop of sweat ran down my temple and landed on my knee. I watched it soak into the fabric, a small dark circle spreading. I pressed my thumb into it. The fabric was damp. I kept my thumb there until the circle stopped growing. For the first time, I wondered if winning the award would feel hollow because the one person I wanted to prove wrong would still think I was nothing. I stared at the invitation. The letters blurred. I blinked and felt tears I did not even know were there. One fell on the glossy paper. I wiped it away with the back of my hand, but it left a small smudge. My knuckles were white around the edge of the envelope. I pressed my palm flat against it, feeling the edge dig into my skin. I stayed like that, counting the beats of my heart against the steering wheel. 27. 31. 43. When I finally looked up, the rain had stopped. I saw my reflection in the wet glass, hollow eyes, a face I barely recognized. I wiped my face with both hands, started the car, and drove to my studio. I opened my grandmother's old drafting ruler, the one she gave me when I was 12, and set it on my desk. Its wooden edge was worn smooth from years of her hand. I ran my finger along it and breathed in the faint smell of pencil shavings. I held it against my palm, feeling the weight. I looked at the ruler, and then at my phone. The screen was dark, but I knew the message was still there. I would not let her silence decide my future. I slid the ruler into my jacket pocket, next to the flash drive, and locked the studio door behind me. My hand did not shake when I turned the key. I sat on the floor of my studio for another hour. I pulled out the torn sketch from the shoebox and laid the pieces in front of me. I did not tape them. I traced the lines with my finger, one by one. Then I took a fresh sheet of paper and redrew the house from memory. The lines were cleaner, stronger. I signed the bottom, Vivian Ashworth. I left it on my desk, face up. I stared at it for a long time. The paper was white. The ink was black. My signature was clear. At 2 a.m., I opened my file box and pulled out the folder labeled Evidence. I went through every document, every email, every timestamp. I laid them on my desk in order. I took a photo of them with my phone. Then I sat back and looked at the pile. It was 5 years of silence, 5 years of waiting. I closed my eyes and listened to the rain start again, tapping against the window in a rhythm I could almost name. I counted the taps. 12, 20, 35. A drop of water from my hair fell onto the top document. I watched it spread, then carefully blotted it with my sleeve. I would not lose this one. I held the document up to the light. The paper was thin. I could see my fingers through it. I set it back down, placed a glass paperweight on top of the stack, and turned off the light. I found an old folder in my grandmother's attic. Her personal file on my mother's past ethics violation, kept for 5 years. Inside was a memo from the licensing board, a signed confession my mother made to avoid charges, and a note for Vivienne if she ever needs it. That was the spark. 3 weeks before the ceremony, I met the a president in his office. His walls were covered with photos of award ceremonies. The carpet was thick, the kind that muffles footsteps. I showed him my project timeline, my sketches, the metadata from my CAD files. He was reluctant to intervene in a family matter. Then I showed him my grandmother's file. He read the confession, looked up at me, and said, "I'll record, but only if I witness it firsthand." I slid the folder back into my bag and thanked him. He asked, "Why now?" I told him, "Because I finally have proof she never believed in me." Micro obstacle. As I left his office, my phone buzzed. A text from my mother. "Dinner Friday. Bring nothing." My heart jumped. I realized if she canceled the dinner, the recording wouldn't happen. I called my grandmother from the parking garage, my hands tight on the phone. The concrete walls echoed my footsteps. "She can't cancel. Please, keep the dinner alive." My grandmother's voice was steady. It's already handled. I didn't ask how. I sat in my car for 10 minutes, my palms sweating against the steering wheel. A security guard knocked on my window. "Mom, you can't park here." I started the engine and drove, my hands still shaking. I gripped the wheel harder. The leather was slick with sweat. 2 days before the dinner, my mother called me. "Dinner's off. Your grandmother's acting strange." I hung up and drove straight to my grandmother's house. She was in the kitchen, slicing apples. She didn't look up. "She won't cancel," my grandmother said. I told her I invited an important client of mine. She loves the chance to show off. I exhaled, leaning against the counter. The apple slices were neat, uniform. My grandmother slid one toward me. I ate it, the tartness sharp on my tongue. The knife in her hand was steady. I asked, "What if she finds out who he really is?" My grandmother paused. "She won't. She never pays attention to anyone but herself." I looked at her hands, the same hands that had held the ruler, that had placed the blanket on me when I was 12. "She'll be there," my grandmother said. "I promise." Micro-obstacle at the dinner itself. I made sure a president was seated near my mother. Mid-meal my phone buzzed. He had texted me, "She's doing it." I felt my heart pound. I kept my face still, my hands under the table, one wrapped around the other. Across the table, Margot caught my eye. She didn't smile, but she gave a tiny nod, as if to say, "I'm here." Then, just as my mother started her speech, my phone vibrated again. A missed call from the a president's office. I realized he might have pocket dialed. For a split second, I thought the recording might be interrupted. I saw him shift in his seat, glance at his phone, then set it back down. The red light on the recording app was still on. I breathed. But then my mother turned to me and said, "What's wrong, Vivienne? You look pale." I picked up my water glass, took a slow sip, and said, "Nothing." The glass was cold against my lips. My hand did not shake. I set the glass down. The water inside rippled once and settled. The next morning, I met the award committee chair. I handed over the voice memo, my grandmother's file, and my metadata. The committee refused at first. They said they could not use personal audio. Then the president confirmed he had recorded as a neutral witness. They agreed to play it before the award. Tara looked at me and said, "We'll make sure everyone hears what she said." I held the flash drive out to him. He took it, turned it over in his hand, and nodded once. Micro-obstacle. As I left, the committee chair called me back. "There's a technicality. The audio needs to be submitted by the end of today to be admissible for the ceremony. The office closes at 5 p.m. I looked at my watch. It was 3:47. I ran 4 blocks in heels, made it to the administrative office at 4:59, and slid the flash drive across the counter. My breath was ragged. My blouse was damp with sweat. The clerk raised an eyebrow but processed it. I leaned against the wall outside, my breath shallow, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The clock on the wall clicked to 50 as the door locked behind me. I called my grandmother from the sidewalk. "It's done." She said, "Good. Now, rest." I stood there for a minute, watching people walk past. A woman with a stroller. A man in a suit. The city kept moving. I saved the audio file in 3 places. In the locked file box with my grandmother's documents, in my email, on a flash drive I kept in my jacket pocket. The subject line on the president's email read "Dinner Oct 12. Amphora." The timestamp matched the dinner exactly. I tested the file twice. It played perfectly. I held the flash drive in my palm for a long moment, the cool metal against my skin. I pressed my thumb into it. The metal was smooth, unmarked. Micro-obstacle that night, my brother called me. "Mom's asking questions. She heard you met with the a president." I froze. "What did you tell her?" A long pause. "Nothing. But she's suspicious." I sat on my studio floor, my back against the wall. I counted to 10. Then 20. Then I called my grandmother. She knows something. My grandmother's voice was calm. Let her wonder. She'll be too proud to cancel the ceremony. She wants to see you lose too much. I asked, what if she doesn't come? My grandmother said, she'll come. Trust me. I pressed my forehead against my knees. The floor was cold. I stayed like that for 5 minutes. Then I got up and checked the flash drive again. 2 days before the ceremony, my brother called me again. I almost didn't pick up. I know what she did, he said. His voice was tight. She told me to lie for her, about the company, about the money. I'm done. I sat down on my studio floor. Why are you telling me now? A long pause. Then, because you're the one who actually built something. I just stood there and let her. He sent me a photo of a notary stamp and a signed document with my father's name, my mother's handwriting. I saved it immediately. I did not ask him to come to the ceremony, but I knew he would be there. I called him back. Why now? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I saw what she did to you when we were kids. I never said anything. I'm done not saying anything. I heard him exhale. I'll be there. I also called Alicia, a clerk at the licensing board who had processed my mother's revocation years ago. I found her through a mutual contact. She agreed to come to the ceremony. Her reason was personal. My mother had accused her of incompetence during the investigation. Alicia had waited 6 years for someone to finally hold my mother accountable. I met her for coffee. She was a thin woman with sharp eyes and a scar on her hand from a paper cut she'd gotten while filing my mother's case. She said, I remember your mother's file. I remember thinking, someone in that family will need this one day. She handed me a copy of the revocation order. Take it. I have the original. I asked why she was helping me. She looked at me and said, because your mother lied about me. She said I'd made a mistake. I didn't, and I've been waiting for someone to prove it. She stirred her coffee slowly. The spoon clicked against the cup. I watched her hand. Steady. 2 days later, at the convention center soundcheck, I saw my mother arrive early. She walked past me without acknowledging me. I watched her from the stage, adjusting the microphone. I slid my phone out of my pocket and read the old message. See you at the stage. I smiled. She had no idea. I touched the flash drive inside my jacket and felt its hard edge against my chest. My grandmother walked into the ballroom, took a seat in the front row, and caught my eye. She pulled a worn leather envelope from her purse, held it up so only I could see, then nodded once and looked straight ahead. A few other family members noticed but said nothing. My cousin Margaret was sitting a few rows back. She gave me a small, tight nod. I tucked the flash drive deeper into my pocket and watched my mother adjust her pearl necklace, still smiling. Peter walked in late, took a seat in the back. He caught my eye and gave me a thumbs up. I almost laughed. Alicia, the clerk from the licensing board, sat in the 4th row. She was wearing a blue dress I had never seen before. She did not look at my mother. She looked at me, and she nodded once. Final micro-obstacle. 10 minutes before the ceremony started, my mother stood up and walked toward the stage. I thought she was going to talk to the committee. Instead, she stopped at the sound booth. I saw her lean in and say something to the technician. My heart stopped. I walked over quickly, my heels clicking on the floor. Is there a problem? I asked. My mother smiled. Just making sure the audio is working. Wouldn't want any mistakes. The technician looked at me, said, the audio is fine. My mother's smile tightened. She walked back to her seat. I looked at the technician. He gave me a small nod. The file was safe. I touched the flash drive in my pocket. Still there. Still cold. The ceremony began. 400 architects filled the hall. The air smelled of fresh carpet and expensive perfume. My mother sat in the front row, smug, arms crossed, her pearls catching the stage lights. After the opening remarks, the committee chair called me to the stage. I walked up, my hands steady for the first time in years. I saw my mother lean forward. Then she stood and announced loudly, "This is a mistake. She didn't design that building. She stole the work. A few relatives murmured. My father looked at the floor. My grandmother sat motionless. In the third row, my cousin Margot put her hand over her mouth. A man I didn't recognize whispered something to the woman next to him. My aunt froze, her wine glass halfway to her lips. My uncle, my mother's brother, slowly set his program down. He stared at my mother with an expression I had never seen on his face before. My brother, in the row behind her, gripped the armrests of his chair. I saw his knuckles go white. The chair raised his hand. "We have independent verification." He signaled the audio tech. A technician adjusted the microphone. A hush fell. The click of the sound system, the faint hum of the speakers, the pause. My mother's face twitched. Then the recording played. My mother's voice filled the room. "Vivienne? Still drawing houses. My son has a real career." Silence. 3 seconds. Only the soft whir of the ventilation system. My mother's face drained of color. Her hands gripped the armrests. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She slumped back into her seat as if pushed, her pearls swinging against her throat. Her wine glass tilted and a thin line of red ran onto the white tablecloth. She did not reach for it. My aunt set her own glass down carefully, as if afraid the clink would break something. A woman in the 5th row turned to her companion and whispered. The companion shook her head slowly. The committee chair looked directly at her. "The National Architecture Award goes to Vivienne Ashworth." He paused. The room was still. Let's hear what her mother thought of her talent. My grandmother rose from her seat. She walked to the stage, holding the leather envelope. She did not speak until she reached me. Then she said quietly, "I saw what she did. I kept quiet because I was waiting for the right moment. I've been preparing for 5 years to make sure she could never take this from you." She pressed the envelope into my hand. I could feel the paper inside, the same yellowed memo I had found in her attic. The paper crackled as I touched it. As I touched it, I smelled dust, old paper, lavender. Then, from the 3rd row, Margot stood up. Her chair scraped against the floor. She looked at my mother, then at me, and said, "I heard you tell her she had no talent. I was there. I never forgot it." Her voice was steady. She sat back down without waiting for an answer. A ripple of whispers passed through the rows behind her. A woman in the 5th row turned to her companion and whispered something. The companion shook her head slowly. A man in a gray suit looked at my mother, then at me, then at my grandmother. His face was unreadable. My mother's brother, my uncle, shifted in his seat. He looked at my grandmother, then at my mother, and said, "You've been like this your whole life." I just never said anything. He stood up and walked out of the ballroom without another word. The door swung shut behind him with a soft thud. My father stayed seated, his face gray, staring at the tablecloth. His hand was wrapped around his water glass, but he wasn't drinking. He hadn't moved since the recording started. His thumb traced the rim of the glass, around and around. I watched it for a second. Around and around. Then Alicia, the clerk from the licensing board, stood up. She walked to the front row. She did not look at my mother. She handed a folded document to the committee chair and said, "This is the revocation order from the state licensing board. It confirms her license was revoked for forgery." I processed it myself. She turned and walked back to her seat. My mother made a sound, half gasp, half whimper. Her hand flew to her chest. The pearls slipped sideways, tangled in her necklace. One of them dropped onto the table, rolling slowly toward the edge. I watched it roll. No one reached for it. It fell to the floor with a small click that seemed to echo in the silence. I heard it bounce once, twice, then roll under the table. My mother did not look for it. She stared straight ahead, her face white, her hands shaking in her lap. I paused for a moment, looking out at the crowd. Before I tell you what happened next, I need to ask you something. Comment the word T below if you believe a mother's cruelty should always be exposed. I looked down at the envelope in my hand, its corners softened from years of being handled in silence. My grandmother's handwriting was still there on the front, for Vivienne. Then my brother stood up. He walked to the front row, pulled a folded document from his jacket, and laid it on the table in front of my mother. "You forged Dad's name on that property transfer," he said. His voice cracked, but he kept going. "I have the notary stamp photo." My mother's face went white. Not pale. White. Like paper. Like the memo in my grandmother's folder. She tried to speak. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Her hands were shaking now, visible from the stage. She reached for her wineglass, but knocked it over instead. The red wine spread across the white tablecloth, a dark stain that kept growing. She stared at it, frozen. Her fingers were curled, trembling, as if reaching for something she could not grasp. The committee chair cleared his throat. "We have more than enough." He turned to me and handed me the award. A heavy crystal tower. It caught the stage lights and threw rainbows across the floor. I looked at my mother. Her pearls were still wet with wine. Her mascara had smeared. She was staring at the crystal in my hands as if it were a weapon. I did not say a word. I just looked at her. For the first time in my life, my silence was enough. The applause started slow, then built. Peter was clapping in the back row. Margaret was crying. My grandmother was standing now, her hand on my shoulder. I held the crystal up. The room went quiet again. "I designed the building," I said. My voice was clear. Every line, every beam. I have the metadata to prove it. I did not look at my mother again. I did not need to. The AIA prize money, $50,000, was deposited in my account, and the $2.3 million urban renewal contract was signed with my firm as the lead architect. My mother stopped attending family gatherings. She now lives in a rental apartment on the far south side, and none of her friends from the dinner speak to her anymore. My brother calls me once a month now. We don't talk about it. We don't need to. I keep my phone on my nightstand, the screen still showing the message, "See you at the stage," and every morning I look at it before I walk into my studio. Sometimes I run my finger over the worn edge of my grandmother's ruler, still in my jacket pocket. The wood is smooth. The years are in it. And on the wall of my office, I hung the torn sketch I made at 12, the one she threw away, now framed, its creases visible through the glass, a reminder that what she tried to destroy was always mine to keep. Every morning I look at it, and I remember that the girl who drew that house is the same woman who built a city block. If there is one thing I have learned, it is that the people who are supposed to see us sometimes choose not to, and that silence can hurt worse than any words. When the person who should believe in you refuses to see who you have become, do you keep explaining yourself, or do you finally let your work speak loud enough that no one can look away? If this story found something in you, there are more where this came from. I am Vivienne, and I am finally seen.